you want to talk about awkward, right? Anyone can say it, they just made it all up about anything, right? That's just easy, right? This is complex and it's difficult, but it's challenging, and it's hard stuff for anyone who has ever been or is still within a conservative religious framework.
This is Brave New History. We're here with Dr. James F. McGrath. He teaches at Butler University, and let's see, one of the few biblical scholars that interacts with mythicism. As most people, you can't respond to every idea out there, right? But and then you're also coming out with a new book that's coming out here in October, A to Z of the New Testament.
Yep. So that'll be out in October. Keep telling people, if you live in the UK or other places, I promise it will say A to Z of the New Testament on your covers. So if you need that, pronounce it however you need to. But it's a book that I've really wanted to write for a very long time. And so when Erdmans approached me asking, would I be willing to write something for them for a general audience, I was like, this is just such a great opportunity. And it's really trying to address the disconnect between what scholars, not what scholars do so much in some of the nitty gritty stuff that nobody but us is interested in, but in the stuff that are the general results that most of us take for granted, that seem fairly well established. We treat them almost as common knowledge. We present them in introductory textbooks. And so if you take an introductory course on the New Testament, you find out these things. And yet you can go your whole life in a church, or your whole life, talking with people about the New Testament and having some kind of interest in it, and yet never know these things, right? And who wants to get a New Testament textbook, and wade through, book by book or method by method or something like that? I mean, you've got to have a certain level of interest already in order to do that, and most people don't know what these tools and methods are good for, or maybe even have been warned off some of them. And so there's this disconnect. And so it's really trying to address that by taking this, basic scholarly knowledge about, cultural context, methods, conclusions, authorship and dates, gender issues, all these things that come up in relation to these texts, questions of interpretation, questions of the differences between the Gospels and how to make sense of them, and present them not in a systematic book by book sort of way or a method by method sort of way, but by taking one example that connects with others and sort of meandering from there through it, right? And it's woven through with anecdotes, references to recent commercials, Friends references and things like that. And so I sometimes have told people it's like a Pete Enns book, but for people who are like fans of Friends instead of fans of baseball, that sort of thing, for those who know Pete Enns writing. But it's trying to address this fact that oftentimes people, when they first encounter biblical scholarship, are like, why has no one ever told me this? And this is true even in churches, mainline churches, liberal churches, where, it's not just the case, as is also true in most conservative churches, that the pastors have at least studied some of this stuff and are aware of it, but they embrace it, right? They accept the conclusions of scholarship. They're aware of these things. And I think the main issue is just that, something like the synoptic problem, right? The question of how Matthew, Mark, and Luke relate to one another, it's not a great sermon topic, right? I mean, nobody wants to sit there and listen to that as a sermon, right? That's not what people go to church to hear. And so there needs to be another place for that. And certainly you can have classes where somebody teaches that, but then again, it would have to be the pastor, and the pastor's often busy with other stuff and not doing the Sunday school class. And so it never reaches people. And so this book is an attempt to address that. I'm hoping that churches, secular book clubs, other groups, anyone with an interest in the New Testament we'll take a look at this book, perhaps put together reading groups. I'm happy to do video chats with groups if that's at all useful, answer questions, dig into further detail. But it really is an attempt to see whether it's possible to get somebody essentially the equivalent of an introductory course on the New Testament without it having to be laid out in a way that assumes either you're taking it for credit and so you're already motivated, or you have a very, very high level of interest. And so to sort of wander through, start with interesting things, and work inductively, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. And you would think more people would be interested in biblical studies if, they knew a bit more, right? Like, I just recently learned, and I'm the exact same thing about why did nobody tell me this before, right? About Acts and the Damascus Road conversion, just like Moses on Mount Horeb. Is that what it's called? The burning bush.
Some versions, yeah.
And
or Sinai and others.
Oh, see, I didn't know that Mount Sinai, or like all the hidden things in it, which it's not to be taken literally. Or I've heard Damascus means like about face in the what is it, Aramaic? I don't know what, but in any case, about go ahead.
I was just gonna say I could take a look at the I'm not sure. I've never really looked at the etymology of the name. And I don't know. That sounds like the sort of thing that again might get quoted in a sermon and then get repeated, and then You mentioned the mythicists, and one of the things that often happens is that it's debates sort of on the same sort of playing field, right? So it's I was told that Jesus fulfills prophecy, and that's why I believe in him as my savior. And then somebody has a turnaround and becomes an atheist and rejects that and says, I was told he fulfills all these prophecies, therefore they started with the prophecies and invented him. Whereas a historian and somebody who's using historical methods looks at the prophecies, the so-called prophecies in a lot of cases, because a lot of times in their original context they're nothing of the sort, looks at Jesus and notices, sometimes they're like crowbarring Jesus into this text, right? Trying to make him fit, which doesn't make sense if they're starting with these texts as supposed prophecies. And then you don't have to, if you're inventing from scratch, you don't have to start with stuff that doesn't quite match and then crowbar, right? And that's in fact one of the reasons why secular scholars across the board are persuaded that there was a historical Jesus. The fact that the claims that are being made about him involve them sort of saying, and the reason why there's this awkward thing about how he died, for instance, that doesn't seem to quite fit what we're saying, that he's the Davidic anointed one who restores the line of David to the throne. There's a very good explanation, and here's what it is, right? Which is kind of convoluted for somebody. If you're inventing, usually you invent better from scratch, hopefully.
Yeah, I know that was Christopher Hitchens' argument on historicity, right? That if you're just going to make it up whole cloth, why not just make it up whole cloth and not have these weird quirks to it, right? Like he's called Jesus of Nazareth. Well, you would think he's from Nazareth then, but he's supposed to be from Bethlehem. Although my reading of John, it seems to be he's from Galilee, right? Or not Galilee. Where does John say he's from? Nothing good comes out of Galilee.
Nazareth, which is in Galilee.
Nazareth,
right?
got it.
Galilee's the region. So, so you're right. You're doubly right.
Yeah. Why? Thank you. I try. But
you're right twice. Right?
Yep. Can't beat it. Yeah, I was thinking nothing good comes out of Galilee, or is it nothing good comes out of? No, what good can come out of? I don't know, but yeah. So it seems that he's born in Nazareth. But why make that like why have this contradiction, right? And and I was thinking about this weird seeming contradictions, and to our viewers, we'll get into mythicism for sure, but this whole, how people make a big deal out of this generation shall not pass away until all these things have come. Have you ever thought about when Jesus says not one stone will be left on another? And then we have the Western Wall. There's plenty of stones left on another. You wonder what is going on there, right?
Yeah, yeah. So there's another example of something where there's what seems like a prediction, right, that doesn't match what actually happened, right? So this there's some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God come with power, right? It's awkward. Uh, the prediction of the temple's destruction was a serious liability, right? We get in the Gospels that they're like, well, it was false witnesses, although they did seem to agree, right? And the Gospel of John, it's like he said that, but we realized later he was talking about his body, and this is about the resurrection, right? He's saying it in the temple and talking about the destruction of the temple, and of course, it's actually interesting that it acknowledges that at the time nobody thought he was talking about anything other than the temple, but then it gets reworded slightly and it gets reinterpreted with hindsight. But of course, once the temple was destroyed in the year 70, then this saying that had been a liability, they were like, oh, now we can do get some mileage out of this, right? And so when you study these texts historically, you get a sense of what order they're written in, which ones can come first, what the context is. We can pick up on things like that. Something is just a fact, and then it becomes a liability, and then it becomes a former liability that we can get some mileage out of in light of some more recent events. And all of that allows us to understand what we're dealing with here, which is a human movement, right? A system of beliefs, right? And we still have those. And understanding it as accurately as possible is important, not just because people use these texts in a variety of harmful ways today, but also because when we can look back at something with a bit of distance, it often helps us see things which it's even easier to miss. If it's easy to miss some of these things in ancient texts and movements and systems of belief, it's even easier to miss what's going on in our own time until it's too late to do anything about it, or we're looking back and saying, yeah, I wonder why nobody saw that this was what was going on there.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so much of that where it just seems layered, and we wonder if we're just reading too far into it. But some of these things, it's just so convincing, right? Like the different layers of John, right? Mm-hmm. For example. And
yeah,
I mean, that's what go ahead.
I was just going to say, so source criticism is one of the things I talk about, in A to Z of the New Testament. And it's one of the things that I tackle in courses I teach regularly. And on the one hand, trying to identify in every detail the exact form of an underlying source, right, inevitably gets more and more hypothetical. And sometimes you have people trying to say, well, this source actually came together in layers, and to subdivide it and things like that, which gets even more hypothetical. But we can acknowledge that there's a lot of room for uncertainty and even possibility of being completely wrong about some of the details, and yet have the sense that, okay, but there are some passages where it seems very clear that there's use of a source, right? And so that's another one of those things that often gets missed out entirely in the debates between the conservative religious folks and the mythicists or people like that, is that it's either it's all pure truth, unadulterated, or it's pure lies, unadulterated. And history, human literature, human systems of belief are much messier things. And there's a mixture, right? There's truth, there's falsehood, and there's stuff that's in between, right? Where it's a falsehood with some spin on it, right? Or some truth with some spin on it, or whatever, And so doing justice to that complexity is precisely what a lot of people like to avoid. And that's one reason why sometimes they don't learn as much as people like me think they should about New Testament scholarship.
Yeah. And it just wouldn't preach well too, I think, is the big thing. Yeah.
It doesn't preach well in your atheist gathering any better than it preaches in a fundamentalist church or something.
Yeah, you want that certainty, right? And whether it's you're a YouTuber that's a mythicist, or whether you're an apologetic person, your people don't want nuance. Well, I guess under those specific groups they don't want nuance, but maybe the majority of people do, right? That Don't want to know how it is.
Yeah, I think human beings are capable of coping with nuance and with uncertainty. I think it needs to be handled in a sensitive way. Right? Nobody likes, like complete. Nobody likes complete uncertainty, right? Nobody likes feeling completely adrift. And particularly when it comes to big questions, about our morals, our values, things like that, we put anchors in, and when the anchor doesn't hold, it's like, you start panicking, right? And people then react emotionally. And so figuring out how to address these things in a way that is actually, accessible and sensitive and helps you navigate it, right? I mean, I really do think that one of the reasons why I didn't have quite the reaction that I did is that, I came to, I found my way into a fairly conservative form of evangelical Christianity in my teens, right? Had a born again experience, that sort of thing, but wasn't brought up steeped in it. And then that was in the context of a Pentecostal church where it's much more about experience, right? Doctrine, it's like, yeah, okay, yeah, we should throw some doctrine in there too, but that's not what's ultimately important. And so was not so steeped in this idea that believing certain things about the Bible or about God or about Jesus, adhering to certain doctrines is the foundation. Which of course, you read the Bible, it's like, oh, God is supposed to be the foundation, right? This is sort of idolatrous, but I hadn't been steeped in that. And so between that and having, the chance to read, I studied in the UK, and British evangelicalism doesn't have the same degree of conservative to fundamentalist influence in it that you get in the United States. And so when I was in that phase of my life, being exposed to books where, it wasn't, well, let's see if we can come up with a defense of Moses writing the Pentateuch. It was, here are some things later than Moses' time that are mentioned in the Pentateuch. And so if we stick with what the Bible says, we shouldn't think Moses wrote the Pentateuch. And I was like, okay, well then why is anybody defending this? Okay. And so I think if it's approached in a way that's sensitive to where people are and helps them think through things, then you can actually be open to learning, and you can be open to the fact that the conclusions are less than certain, right? Because nobody has certainty about everything that they think they're certain about, right? They have a feeling of certainty, and that's reassuring, but in almost every case, it involves a certain, either a small or a very large amount of self-deception.
Yeah. No, yeah, that's very true. And I had a similar upbringing with the Evangelical Free Church, which is kind of big here in Minnesota. And it's all like, it's very conservative, right? That this is all literally true, right? And now there's, with Dan McClellan, there's a big thing about like there is no literal, nobody is a biblical literist, right? But after I've learned, I mean, the big thing, maybe it's for a lot of people that Mark didn't write Mark, really. No serious scholar believes that. And then you just want to find, well, what is going on then, right? And then I think maybe some people go one way to say, well, this is all baloney, right? And I hate it. And like it's almost like a Darth Vader moment for them. But then there's also like, well, what is going on? Let's find out, like, what is this about, right? Like, you can feel lied to and hate the text, or you can be like, well, this is interesting. Well, then what's it all about?
Yeah. So I did do the pendulum swing, even though I, had some things that kept me from, having, so in my scholarship, I'd say that, having started out in a context that was, on the conservative end of things, was like, okay, well, let's question everything, and I think it's good to question everything. I mean, people are often surprised when I say, I love that people explore ideas like mythicism. The issue is not exploring ideas. The question is, if the majority of scholars are not persuaded by your arguments, do you try to make better arguments? Do you admit that you might be wrong? Or do you say, well, there's a conspiracy in the academy to, stamp out my genius ideas, and that's the thing that I have issue with, right? If I can't persuade my peers, I'm going to have a book coming out next year about John the Baptist. I've just spent this past year on sabbatical researching it, and I make some new ideas, and the onus is on me to persuade my peers, right? And if I don't, then chances are I'm wrong. But certainly until they become persuaded by maybe somebody's future arguments that build on mine, your best bet is to stick with what the consensus is, right? And not follow my, my wacky views on things. But anyway, talking about pendulum swing, right? I mean, I've certainly come back to, being open to the possibility that somebody named Mark and somebody named Luke in particular might have been the authors of these texts, right? Because those are the two in particular that seem less likely to be invented, right? I mean, why on earth attribute it to Mark, right? Mark is not this important person in this movement, right? There's no obvious reason to do this. And was it the Mark that was the companion of Peter, or is that brought in order to try and give this text more authority? But in some cases, I think just as we have to acknowledge uncertainty about the traditional ascriptions of authorship, there's also uncertainty about them not being by those people, as it were, or by people with those names, right? Because really all we get in our earliest ascriptions, which are fairly consistent, and that's an evidence of a sort, is a name, right? And in the case of John, for instance, right, we get some early indications that there may have been a John known as the Elder, who is different from John, the son of Zebedee, who may have been the author or the editor or something of some of these texts and things like that. And so, I think in a lot of cases, a name got attached to it, probably fairly early, and circulated alongside the text as something that was known, just as happened with most ancient literature. And then the question was, well, how do we make this person into somebody who is an eyewitness or an authority or something like that? Matthew is the one where I'm least persuaded that that's the case, that it wasn't just added in sort of late in the process, because there they may have just been guessing because this individual that's referred to as Levi or Levi in Mark's gospel is called Matthew there. And so, and that passage actually is one of the strongest arguments against Matthew being the author, I think, because the story about this individual's first encounter, supposedly, with Jesus, or his call by Jesus, whatever it was, is repeated almost verbatim from Mark in Matthew, right?
Yeah.
If I encounter Jesus, if there's an existing source, even if it seems less authoritative, I will use it and I'll work it in, and because people are familiar with it, there's reason to do that. But the story of my first encounter with Jesus, there's no way I'm copying somebody else's version of that. Right? It's just not something that somebody would do. And so,
yeah. I have a few thoughts on that. Where, when I was reading Acts and Paul is recounting his conversion experience, each one of those recountings are different, right? And you would think, what is going on there? So he is telling it a little bit different each time. And that's almost hinting at, from what I thought, that none of this is supposed to be taken literally. Like, he's changing it to the crowd he's talking with, right? And regarding Matthean authorship, just as I'm just kind of going off that, my most recent interview was with David Paulman. He's an apologist. And he says, well, Matthew, more than anybody, maybe you've heard this, has references to money in it, right? Money and lending and getting money and, paying everybody, one coin for their day's work, right? Regardless of how long you've worked it. And then so they're like, well, it makes sense this guy's a tax collector then, because he's all about the money, right? Which is just kind of like an interesting way to, I've never heard that or thought about that before. And then the idea with Mark being, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, what's interesting, so some of those same parables are in Luke, and a lot of the times they're thought to come from the Q source that a lot of scholars think may have been used by Matthew and Luke. But what's typical of Matthew is not so much that there are parables about money per se, but almost always the amount of money is larger. And that's, it's like, is this a wealthier community? Is he just used to dealing with larger sums? Has there been a lot of inflation since the story was first told? And so you got to bump up the amounts or something. But for Paul's conversion is an interesting one. That was one that really actually, helped push me over into, it was like, this is just, there's no real way to defend this notion of inerrancy, even with, hundreds of qualifications and adjustments on it. Because in one account, It's like they saw the light but didn't hear. They saw but didn't hear, and the other one
Mhm.
they heard but didn't see. And it's interesting. You read a conservative evangelical translation like the New International Version, and where it uses a word that can mean, it means hear, but obviously when it says one who has he who has ears to hear, let him hear, it's talking about understanding, and so it has a connotation of understanding as well. So they just translated they didn't understand the voice, right?
Mm.
And so lots of papering over contradictions and tensions in translations that are marketed to so-called biblical literalists, which then reinforces it and makes it possible because people read these translations that smooth over issues, and then you can actually read it and convince yourself you're taking the Bible literally and you don't find any contradictions there because you're reading a translation that has worked very hard and sometimes taken liberties with the text in order to give you that impression.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And along those lines, going back to the whole "it's a conspiracy among scholars" deal, that there's that whole, because I was reading through Acts, ready to hear the whole "it's hard to kick against the goads," right?
Mm-hmm.
And to see if the whole Dr. McDonald
Mm-hmm.
mimesis thing, and like what's that all about. And I'm reading through it, and he's already gone over, he's recounting it, and we have the original story, and then I'm like, did I just miss it? Right, like where he never said it. He's already repeated the story, and we heard the story, and then on like the second or third retelling of it, he's like, Paul, it's hard to kick against the goats. And like, it's only after like, I don't know how many times he's retold it that he has this here. Right. And then, which, mythicists will often say like, oh yeah, because, scholars will reject mythicism, right? That I've heard it said, Dr. McDonald, he has a, MDiv, and that makes him he's steeped in religion, right? And so he can't be taken seriously. Well, anybody who is wanting to know about religion would have like a degree in it, and that's what the degree is. So it's like
Yeah,
you
and a
can't
lot,
win really.
right?
Yeah.
And a lot of us, have gotten into this because of not just religious beliefs, but sometimes conservative religious beliefs. And studying these texts has changed our mind. Right? If anything, I would think that means where you can look to people who are where that has happened. It's like they're at least trying to be honest about things, right? But the whole notion that it's like well, you're steeped in religion or you still have religious loyalties, things like that. That's why you say that Jesus existed. It's like, okay, so Jesus said that the dawn of the kingdom of God is going to happen while some of the people who are still there are still alive, and that didn't happen. And so I'm left with this figure who gets that major thing wrong and dealing with that. And yet somehow, because he existed, I'm taking comfort, right, in this. It's like, what's comforting about his mere existence, right? The historical Jesus is awkward for conservative religious belief, right? And what mythicists often have is it's not just not the historical Jesus, it's not the Jesus that you actually encounter in the earliest gospels, right? Where he's not a divine figure, right? He is doing exorcisms and other things because people did that, right? I mean, you have faith
Mhm.
healers and exorcists even in our time, right? That's not an argument against historicity. It's not an argument for divinity, any of that kind of stuff, right? But what they have is this invented divine person who supposedly is the start of it. And then they have to say, well, but then they turned all that into this elaborate metaphor for this divine person in these stories that sound like they're about a person living on earth who might just be, another apocalyptic prophet type figure or messianic claimant who predicts the kingdom of God will dawn within his generation and is wrong about it. The historical Jesus is much more awkward, and I don't know why anyone, who is, who's actually interested in making a case against conservative religious beliefs, would take mythicism, which isn't, and embrace that, which isn't taken seriously and is a lot more problematic, instead of saying, okay, here's what scholars conclude, here's what historians conclude, and you want to talk about awkward, right? Anyone can say they just made it all up about anything, right? That's just easy, right? This is
Mhm.
complex and it's difficult, but it's challenging, and it's hard stuff for anyone who has ever been, or is still within a conservative religious framework. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Like, yeah, do I take comfort in, just knowing deep in my heart there was a historical person, right? Which would seem like less comforting to a conservative, right? Like, I mean, it's almost better to say, like, oh, it's all baloney rather than, you know, what do we want to say then? It, I guess to
How's
the
this,
to the
how's this
extremist.
for an
Yeah.
analogy? Yeah, I was just
What's
thinking,
that?
how's this for an analogy, right? It's like somebody who, it's, sees evidence in the sources that, God exists, but is, actually out to get them, and not very nice, and really wants to inflict a lot of suffering on them. And it's like, yeah, well, you're concluding that because you're religious, but you're secretly taking comfort in the fact that God still exists in this framework. It's like, presumably on that framework, you would much prefer that there isn't a divine entity out to get you, right? At that point, it's just one of those things where it's like, taking the time to, you know, I seriously believe that if people who subscribe to mythicism turn actual skepticism, like in careful investigation and critical analysis and weighing of evidence in a detailed sort of way, onto mythicism, right? The same way that scholars do in dealing with biblical texts, they will find it wanting, right? Again, not in terms of saying that some things are mythical. That's mainstream history, right? Mainstream historians say that not everything that's in the Gospels is historical, right? And so I remember I was talking with someone, I think it was actually on a comment on one of your YouTube videos recently, where they're like, well, I'm mostly a mythicist, right? Or something like that. It's like,
Yeah.
you're not. You subscribe to, you might be on this end of the spectrum of views that are held by scholars, but that's mainstream scholarship, that there was a historical Jesus and that there's a lot of fabricated stuff about him, right? That's a well a well-respected view among scholars, right? It's not the only view, right? There are other nuances among it, but the view that it's all completely made up, or the view that it's all completely factual, are both views that are only taken seriously in contexts in which there is a strong ideological axe to grind, and that includes, institutions that may even have a label like university, but are essentially fundamentalist institutions where you actually have to sign a statement of faith in order to work there, right? People
Yeah.
there are not doing research in the same sense that secular scholarship means that term. But mythicists are often doing the same thing, right? They're gathering a community of people who are just dismissing, who are quote mining scholars and taking a little from here and a little from there and assembling from that this viewpoint that no actual scholar holds to, or maybe just a couple do, but which is not as persuasive as what most scholars think.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a criticism of a lot of or that a lot of mythicists make, is that, to study at this school or to work there, you have to sign a statement of faith. And so if somebody is honest about, this is the claim, that about what they believe, they're kicked out because that's not according to their
Yeah.
statement of faith, right?
Yeah. So I have no problem, recommending that people, look closely at what the ideology of an individual is, right, when they look to them for information, but also of any institution that they're employed by, right, and things like that, right? Those are the kinds of things that, just are just what we call information literacy skills, right? If you get a librarian in to do a tutorial about information literacy with your students, how to identify reliable sources and not fall for misinformation in any area, you look at things like, I mean, perspective, right? What is, what axe do they have to grind? Who's funding this? Those kinds of questions
Mhm.
need to be asked. And that's why, I mean, to be honest, I think I have a great privilege. I think it's one of the reasons why I still consider myself, what you'd call a liberal Christian, is that I work at an institution where there's been no pressure to be any sort of religious person, never mind one particular sort, or to not be. And I'm pretty sure if I'd kept working in a conservative institution, I might have been, in order to keep my job, still publishing stuff that was making the case for these conservative views. But I might have also lost any kind of actual spirituality that I had, because when you study, you often find things that are disconcerting, and being in an environment in which you're told you're not allowed to explore that, you're not allowed to pursue that. Yes, you're finding it in the Bible, but really the problem is you, right? I mean, all that is toxic, right? To critical thinking, but to spirituality and to morality and to honesty. And so I think that there is a case to be made, and of course there are people on both ends of the ideological spectrum that might disagree, but I think there's a case to be made to looking, to a range of views, but in particular focusing on people who are, in contexts in which there's no compulsion upon them to draw some specific kind of conclusion, where they have the freedom to pursue research and to draw the conclusions that they think are most likely to be correct.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I'm biased because I work at that kind of institution.
How's that?
I said I'm biased because I work at that kind of institution.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So, along the lines of, this disquieting passages and whatnot, and in Mythicism, right? If you're familiar with Mythicism, and a bit of a big deal is made of what is it, 2 Thessalonians 2:14 through 16, where it says the wrath of God has come upon them at last, because that's the last part, and the Jews killed Jesus, if you're familiar with that passage. And the mythicists will say, well, that's interpolation, right? That was put in there later, because I think F.C. Bauer said that. Is it the consensus that that's legit, or is there any debate among scholars that that's legit?
Yeah. So there's always, there's almost always the possibility that something is an interpolation. And in some cases, a bit of text will actually move around in the manuscript, right? Occur in different places, which often is very strong. Even if we don't have a text that lacks it, may be very strong evidence that this was a marginal comment or something like that, that then found its way into the text and got inserted in more than one place by different scribes or things like that. In this case, it really is just that this view doesn't seem to be quite. I mean, 2 Thessalonians, it's hard to know what to do with, because there's debates about its authenticity. Ironically, precisely because it's so much like 1 Thessalonians, and yet seems to have a different view of the nearness of the end. And so it seems like it might be an effort to, basically to argue against 1 Thessalonians, and to do so in the name of Paul. And what's interesting is it actually contains, it's like, don't be troubled by something that seems like it could be like a word or a letter as though it's from us, right? Which,
yeah.
If you're naive, you'd assume is an indication of authenticity, but obviously a good forger will put something like that in there and say, and so be on the lookout for forgeries, right? And that's
although they're undisputed, aren't they?
No, so I mean, 1 Thessalonians is pretty much undisputed, and many would say is the earliest of Paul's letters. 2 Thessalonians, there's a significant amount of debate about.
Interesting. And did I have it right that that's 2 Thessalonians, or that passage that I quoted?
Let me look it up, because I don't.
Because
think people would have this memorized. I'm mostly a Gospels guy, and so when you ask me about where in Paul is that, I'm like, I know these texts almost by heart, but you ask me for the verse numbers, and
that I wouldn't think Mythicists would be even talking about it unless it was undisputed.
Right, that's 1 Thessalonians. That would explain why it's not. I was wondering, because I was like, isn't that? But I was not sure. And
got it.
You had notes prepared, I assume, for this meeting, or may not have. Whereas I have no notes here about 1 Thessalonians or 2 Thessalonians.
Yeah.
But yes, so that's So on the one hand, there's a fair amount of suggestion that that might be an interpolation. Partly because it it just doesn't seem. They've been suggesting that this doesn't seem like it fits right in with other things, right? Killed the Lord Jesus. On the other hand, if you have the Gospels already well known, then that seems like something that who would invent that once you've got the Gospels well known with the Romans, right? On the other hand, what's interesting is that we do have we can trace over the gospel tradition, and this might be an argument for this being an interpolation, right? It's the kind of argument one can make. And as somebody who doesn't really work on First Thessalonians much, I will confess that I am drawing on memory and combined with the things I know about how scholars reason. The tendency is to shift blame more and more away from the Romans, right? I mean, you have Jesus apprehended and almost immediately handed over to the Romans. Why? Because the Romans wanted him, right? And the Jewish authorities are concerned that if they don't get this person who the Romans are interested in to the Romans are going to send in troops to get him, and then more than one person's going to die, right? And having the Romans execute the person that is at the center of your movement is not a good marketing strategy. In fact, it may cost more people their lives, right? If they're like, so why was this person executed? Let's take a close look at this group and what they're saying now. It's like nobody wanted that. And so there's this move to shift things away, to say that the Jewish authorities sort of twisted Pilate's arm and things like that. And so this does seem to reflect that sort of later view. And so that's the kind of reasoning that you get there. But we don't, it's not as though this is missing, as far as I'm aware, from manuscripts. So just as with, mythicists will sometimes make the case that, anything that sounds like it's a historical, referring to a historical Jesus in certain of Paul's letters, it's like, well, that's an interpolation. It's like, interpolation, sometimes, I mean, we should be open to it, right? We should never close the door on that as a possibility. But it's something that you resort to when the text in the present form seems to require it, right? And what happens in the case of mythicism often is not that the text, as we have it, seems to require it, but that mythicism requires it, and therefore, and for this text to fit the mythicist framework, then this has to be an interpolation, which is not the same thing.
Absolutely. No, and I think it's so funny that, because I did a bit of reading on that passage, and it never doesn't appear in any version of First Thessalonians. And so you have to go to saying, well, there must have been a version of it where it didn't appear. And mythicists will lose their mind if you appeal to hypothetical documents, right? But it never occurs to them that they're constantly doing that, right? Like a lost epistle, where Paul expressly says that Jesus was from a sperm-bank mother station in the sky, and he was executed by space aliens on the mother station. And, well, I mean, it probably exists somewhere. How have you determined that, right? Or, like, there's probably a manuscript that doesn't have this thing in there, or, I mean, but then the idea of Q is just absurd to them, right? Because, like, if it puts the kibosh on their case, right? Which, like, if Jesus is killed by Jews or Romans, he certainly wasn't killed by aliens aboard, orbiting the moon, right? Because, I mean, Romans and Jews, as far as I know, live exclusively on Earth, right?
No. Right, call them angels. Just don't make them sound even less credible than they are. It sounds bad enough the way they.
Yeah.
But I've sometimes. No, I was just gonna say I've sometimes wanted to jokingly start every time I'm introduced to it in a YouTube video or something where I'm going to be discussing mythicism, to ask the person to say, introduce me as I'm from James McGrath from Butler University in Indianapolis on Earth, right? Not in heaven or something like that, because, you know, if somebody doesn't mention that, you know, it's crucified on earth, it's like, well, you know, because he's assuming, it's like, people were crucified all the time on earth. Didn't happen all the time. You know, there are plenty of places where Paul is talking about something that you'd usually assume would be something earthly and is talking about heavenly, and says heavenly, or says, you know, or something like that. And so, you know, you're absolutely right that although it's not a hypothetical, you know, or, you know, hypothetical lost source or lost epistle per se, it is a framework of reading that brings in things that are not said and imports them, right? Which is, you know, what all of us have the potential to do, right? And that's, again, what historical scholarship, trying to pay attention to the historical context, tries to mitigate to the extent that we can. None of us can read as though we were reading, you know, as though we thought in first century ways, like as though we were internal to these communities, this culture, this time, this place, everything about it. And so we do our best. Right? And I think that on this note, you know, the Heavenly Sperm Bank is not doing its best with Paul's letters.
It's not doing what?
They're not doing their best with trying to read these texts in a contextual way.
Yeah, you know, yeah, it's the whole like seed of David thing, which, you know, seed can mean sperm, but it can also mean like progeny, right? And just to interpret it in that weird way, right? That it always has to be the weird way that falls right how it needs to for mythicism to be true, right?
Yeah, and of course it's based in the experience, which is not entirely wrong, but still is not a valid argument to apply to everything, you know, willy-nilly. That, well, people believe weird stuff, right? You know, and that's true, but that is not, you know, that can't be our explanation for everything, right? In fact, even when people believe weird stuff, oftentimes there is a story that can at least help us understand why they came to believe weird stuff. You know, I mean, to be honest, you know, people who believe that early Christians believed in a celestial sperm bank, in my view, my estimation, believe weird stuff, right? But when you understand what led them to that belief, then it's like, okay, it's weird, but you can understand how someone would reach that. And a lot of these people are, you know, I mean, you know, this is not stupidity, right? This is anything but. You have to be very, very clever to create this kind of counter argument that doesn't accept mainstream views of things, right? You know, as you know, for a brief period in my teens, you know, I got into things like young Earth creationism, and mythicists hate when I make comparisons between young Earth creationism and mythicism, or intelligent design and mythicism. But you know, I don't, you know, as somebody who has become a scholar, I don't think I was stupid back then, right? I think I actually, you know, had to be pretty fast on my feet in order to try and come up with counter arguments to, you know, mainstream science. I did so, you know, poorly and inaccurately lots of times, right? But what's going on is not getting at the truth in that case, right? It's defending a belief system that you already have, right? And in order to do that, it takes a lot less effort. So, which is again why I'm always encouraging people all across the spectrum, you know, investigate, right? Be interested, not in, you know, try and, to the extent that you can, try to not pursue finding that your, you know, what you want to be true is true, and just ask, let me try, to the extent that I can, to read this evidence carefully, paying attention to the details, not pushing away and excluding or treating as assuming as a later insertion anything that doesn't fit, and figure out what these things are saying, and consult scholarship that you need to in order to do justice to the fact that what you're reading are texts in an ancient language. They reflect a different cultural context. They reflect assumptions. They use words which, you know, the ancient equivalent of them, you know, they meant more or less the same thing as our words do. But if you use the word freedom, you know, in, let's say, in a North American context, it has historical connotations, right, that it may not have in another context. Right? And in some places, we won't mention any specifically because we don't want to get distracted, what may be labeled as freedom, or even, you know, put under the heading of a ministry of freedom or something like that may not look like freedom, as others would define it.
Yeah. So let's say being charitable. Maybe we'll say what do you think is the best argument for mythicism, and what would you say is the silliest argument for mythicism?
Oh, it's a good question. And I'm wondering which I should start with in order to get to the, I mean, I think, if what one means is acknowledging that there's room for doubt, right, even about the historicity of Jesus, right? I mean, because that's often what Richard Carrier is talking about when he's talking about probability and using Bayes' theorem and things like that. And if you're talking about uncertainty, that there is a possibility, then yes, there's a possibility, right? And that's always true in historical study. And that's one of the things, maybe the most disconcerting thing for those within a conservative religious framework about history, is that history is always open-ended, right? All it takes is finding one authentic lost text that makes clear that they're making the whole thing up. And does it, I mean, it could still be, is it a forgery? Well, we need to check. Is it, somebody who, got disillusioned with this group very early on and was trying to undermine? Maybe we have to check. But ultimately, if it's authentic and it's, then you've got to rewrite the history, right? And you have an explanation for things. And so it's those attempts to, really actually treat the evidence in detail that I think are the best ones. And I think they're important both because, a lot of times, they do come up with interesting things to say, although the majority of mythicism, when it's not doing its weird, deny any historical Jesus whatsoever thing, is a lot of repeating of what mainstream scholars say. This is not an actual event that happened here. This is not an actual event that happened there. Weighing probability. I mean, even though I think that, when you compare Richard Carrier's conclusions and arguments using Bayes' theorem with, let's say, William Lane Craig's arguments using Bayes' theorem, you see that this is just a tool for, trying to make your thinking and your estimations explicit. And that's a good exercise, right? I'm glad that, he undertook that. If I were persuaded, that some of his reasoning and some of his interpretation of things works, then I might find his outcome in terms of the probability, persuasive. In terms of things that are least persuasive, I mean, you can always look at, Acarius or people like that, basically everything is symbolism, everything is celestial metaphor. It's just like there's almost no attention to detail, right? It's basically what conservatives have historically done with the text, which is, if we don't like what it says, let's turn it into an allegory, right? Let's treat it as a symbolic representation of something else. And so it's just the flip side of that, I think. Having mentioned the sort of Bayes' theorem point and argument like that, I think one thing that also has to be, doesn't get emphasized enough is that each detail, right, about a historical individual, right, has to be weighed on its own terms. And once you have something that is, indicates likely historicity, then the person about whom that is claimed, you have a likelihood of historicity, right? And so if, let's say talk about inherent improbabilities, and so, it's historically likely that James McGrath existed, but it's inherently improbable that he had red hair. And at this point, it's really hard to tell. So it's, this is a good example to use for, nobody's going to be biased by what they've seen on the screen thus far. And there, if you find a document that says, okay, this happened in this one case, this person had this unlikely hair color or combination of hair and eye color or whatever it is, that's evident, right? And, it's not so improbable, right? It's not like a miracle or something. It's not so improbable that you have to say, well, it's inherently unlikely, therefore we're going to assume that this person who says it is wrong, right? That's not how evidence works. And once you have, it's like Paul met Jesus's brother, and because he, uses brothers in another sense, and because when he talks about James, the Lord's brother, he also talks about Peter and others who are not called brothers of the Lord. So he's not talking about Christians in general. And when he does, he doesn't use that expression, brother of the Lord. And so it's likely that Paul meant James's brother, right? It's likely that Jesus was crucified because why do you make up something that seems to disqualify this person as a candidate to be the Messiah, the anointed one who restores the line of David to the throne? Once you have those details, then you have somebody who likely had a brother and who was crucified, about whom some people believe this person was the Messiah, Lord. Right? And the fact that anything else is improbable makes that detail about this historical individual improbable, but doesn't make their existence less probable, right? And it's the same thing that goes to the addresses the mythicist talking point I sometimes come across. It's like, prove Jesus existed first, before we talk about any of the details about what he was like, you've got to prove he existed first. It's like, no, we don't know, we don't have abstract existence of, even a notable influential figure like Alexander the Great, independent of, parentage, victories, that's how history works, right? We know stuff about the person, and we deduce that they existed from the fact that we know these, we're told these things about them. And so I think at all those points, looking closely at even what somebody like Richard Carrier does, but also paying attention to what mainstream scholarship does, will help one understand, and get a nuanced view of these things and understand why most scholars don't draw the conclusions that mythicists do on the question of Jesus' existence.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think Bayes' theorem generally is just, you make a good point where it's trying to quantify what we might think of as subjective. Although, each individual claim is different, right? Where you can't really lump them all together. And it's striking how Bayes' theorem can be used to support the resurrection of Jesus as a historical fact.
Yep.
And also that he never existed at all.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah. And so Bayes' theorem proves beyond any reasonable doubt that Jesus did not exist and rose from the dead.
Which would be truly miraculous. So, if anything's being supported, right?
Yeah. So, our human reasoning, it's good to put out an approximate percentage on it, and to try and do those things, even at least as an exercise, if only to realize how much is intuition and instinct. And it's like, we don't do that in courtroom trials, right? And one thing that I've written about as a sort of side area of interest is, work with a computer scientist at my institution, thinking about artificial intelligence and ethics. How do you program our ethical reasoning into something like a driverless car, right, an autonomous vehicle? And how do you weigh, right? A computer works by weighing, right? It deals with the numbers. How do you weigh the worthwhileness of veering that way when you hit one criminal, right, who maybe deserves to die, but also a pregnant woman, versus veering the other way when you hit 3 school children? It's like, I can't do I don't even know what the math is, right? These are not things that we can easily quantify. And oftentimes our sense that something is likely, it's like, okay, but how likely? It's like, that's not how we think about things. And while I can see the usefulness of the effort to do so, because otherwise it can get a bit iffy, then, I think we also need to acknowledge that that's not in general how our arguments work, right? And there's not something specific to historical Jesus studies, not specific to religious studies or study of ancient Christianity. It's just, you go into any, you serve on a jury, and nobody's saying, okay, but are you 87% sure, or are you only like 65% sure? It's like, I would love to be a fly on the wall if, like, Richard Carrier or somebody does do jury duty and brings those methods with him. That's not where we should probably go with this conversation.
Yeah, for sure. So, yeah, like for me, I think probably the best argument, and this is probably maybe your opinion too, for mythicism is just it's just so complicated. I'm just going to slam the book shut and say it's all baloney because it's so complicated, right? Is probably the best argument for mythicism, really.
Yeah. Well, I think the problem is that, as somebody who works in this field and who's drawn a different conclusion, I think the best argument isn't very good, right? And that's not being insulting. I mean, I'm sorry if it is. I mean, scholars disagree about things, right? There are other things that much more, much larger numbers of scholars hold, where I think, yeah, there's an argument for this, but I don't think it's a very good one, right? And I try and make the case. Here's why. And so, the fact that people make stuff up, I think, that can explain anything, right? And so something that can explain everything explains nothing, they sometimes say. In the same way, the fact that historians have doubted, it's like, they'll say, people once thought that the patriarchs, were historical figures, and now they would say they're almost certainly not. Right? Although they don't put it that way, they say now they know they're not, right? As though we know for certain that there could not possibly have been. That's again not usually how history works. Usually the extreme to which historians get is, we have no reason to conclude that this person did exist, right? Which is still a weaker claim than mythicists saying, yeah, Jesus probably did not exist. And so, it seems to me that recognizing that, the patriarchal narratives in Genesis it's like, okay, so this is a story that's being told, maybe 1,000 years after the time in which these stories are set. Of course, we have no, basis for saying these people are likely historical, right? When you have something written, within a matter of decades, and the person mentions meeting that person's brother, it's different, right? It's a different case. And so one thing that I think is a really weak argument of mythicists is, the flippant analogy, right? It's like, well, but the patriarchs, right? Or, it's like, yeah, I have a book in which, if you read this, you'll think Batman was historical. It's like, you can put any historical figure and Batman in the same sentence. It doesn't prove anything, right? It's just not. It's not only that it's not a good argument. It's not an argument. And I don't know why people do this, except that maybe they've been trained in a conservative Christian context in which coming up with something that impressed other people within your ideology, it didn't have to be an argument. It just had to sort of reinforce you within your sense of community and of rightness. But at any rate, I hope that people will actually look at their own arguments critically and realize when some of them, it's like, you know what? Yeah, that isn't an argument. I should still, at the very least, I may not, move to a mainstream secular scholarly view on this subject, but I'll at least stop making this terrible argument, right? I mean, creationists, even have done this. It's like, yeah, you should all stop using this terrible argument because it makes us look bad. It's like, we look bad enough, right? Disagreeing with mainstream science. We don't need to use arguments that actually have been disproven over and over again, right? And that's, I think, one of the key criticisms of mythicism, if I'm trying to be, helpful, is if you use arguments that actually and make claims and make analogies and use talking points that people who are familiar with the subject will see the problems of, then it actually makes your overall point less persuasive, right? I mean, Galileo Galilei, famous instance that's supposedly debate about, religion and science, but he was pointing to the tides as though that's evidence of the Earth turning, and his contemporaries were saying, yeah, that doesn't work, right? If that was the explanation, then the tides would move like this, and that's not what we see, right? And now we would say, yeah, it's the gravitational attraction of the moon. It has another explanation. And the fact that he used arguments like that, the fact that he also insulted the Pope and things, and did things like that, did not serve him well, right? And so using poor arguments never helps ultimately to promote whatever it is that you think it's really important to promote, and oftentimes just creates this polarization in which it becomes impossible to really make any headway in trying to persuade people of things that you might actually be right about.
Yeah, and I'm thinking when it comes to mythicism, and we've kind of touched on that it's kind of using any argument to skew it in your favor, right? So it's very selective of like, well, this is an interpolation, and this that probably the silliest argument, and also probably my favorite mythicist argument, is polemics, right? So you have Christian polemics of different Christian sects, and it's polemics are made to embarrass your opponent, right? Especially with like weird sexual stuff, right? And that using the argument of embarrassment, right? That if something is embarrassing, they're unlikely to make it up. Polemics are likely true, right? Which is the silliest argument you've probably ever heard. Probably for me, the silliest argument, because like that's the whole point of making up stories, is to embarrass people, right? But if you don't think things through and you need to arrive at this conclusion, then it works for you, right?
Yeah. So when you have a negative depiction of, let's say, the Pharisees, or of, other religious leaders, or competitors of the Christians in Christian sources, that's not where you'd use something like the argument from embarrassment, right? It's not as though, look, the Christians are saying things that make these people look bad, and so they're probably true. That's not the argument, right? The thing is, you don't make up stuff about yourself, right? And even then, it's not, again, understanding, with the nuances of history, it doesn't prove, it's not as though, okay, this was problematic for them, this was something they found awkward, and yet they said it, so it must be historical. All it makes very likely is that the author who says it didn't invent it, right? Whether it can then be traced early enough, and it's so early that it probably was just common knowledge, and the reason they're mentioning it is because everybody already knew this. That's the fuller argument. But oftentimes, things that are legitimate arguments, or legitimate lines of historical reasoning, legitimate things, this happens in the sciences, it happens in medicine, it happens, it's not just, again, history or religious studies, but things that are legitimate arguments become something else in online debates and things like that. They get used by people who aren't quite sure how the method works, or what else has to be part of this argument in order for it to be persuasive. And so it's like, oh, it's embarrassing, therefore, or yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe before we start summing up, do you have like a favorite or most convincing historical Jesus? Like the revolutionary, or yeah.
I mean, I think it's just the fact that, in our earliest sources, right, and that includes some of the earliest gospels, right? It's not as though, Paul is writing, a couple of days after the events, and then you have a few centuries, and then suddenly we have the earliest gospel or something like that, right? We're talking about a difference of decades, right? And we're talking about things that are clearly part of the same movement, and in which a lot of literature gets written, in which there's a lot of overlap and clearly the same overall impression. And we look at them, even the earliest ones, right? Even looking at Paul's letters, and he believes that this individual that he's talking about, right, was crucified, was buried, and was raised, and was exalted, had the name that is above every name, right, the divine name bestowed upon him, and exalted to this position of heavenly lordship, right? But who is he saying that about, right? He's not saying that about a figure that actually already has some sort of heavenly lordship, right? He's saying that about this figure that he says is of the seed of David, right? Descended from David according to the flesh, which naturally means this is the Davidic Messiah being exalted to this status that was not unheard of in the literature of this time, right? And so really, I think the strongest argument is when you read the text as a whole and you read the literature of the time, it sounds like these people are talking about the figure of the Davidic Messiah as we encounter him in some of the more exalted portraits, like First Enoch, things like that, and claiming that this individual with the ordinary name Yeshua, is that person, right? It's not a person with a made-up sounding name or an angelic name or something like that. It's a person's name, right? And everything that's in there gives this impression, right? There's nothing that naturally leads you to think, oh, these people are talking about someone that they recently made up. There's nothing in there that makes you think that they are talking about somebody who, was born of a woman, born under the law, in the heavenly realm, and is of the seed of David according to the flesh, in the heavenly realm. It's like that stuff is not in there, right? Read these texts against the backdrop of the time. That's the best argument, I think, because that's what historians do. And that's what historians do, not just with early Christian literature, but with any literature. And what we're talking about, it's important to emphasize, is early Christian literature, letters, and then, very, very, obviously slanted, ideologically biased lives of Jesus, right? Bioi, right? The ancient equivalent of a biography. We hesitate to call it that because that sounds like, but, they're telling someone's life. And that seems to be the genre that these early accounts of Jesus fit into. And these are not the Bible, right? So I've encountered people who will say, well, make an argument for Jesus' historicity and, don't argue from the Bible because that's circular. It's like, forget the Bible, right? That's a compilation that happens later and it happens to include these texts. What we're asking about are, what do these texts say? And read them against the backdrop of their time, their place, the religious and historical context. You get an impression. And the fact that historians so consistently get that impression, whether they are religious or agnostic or atheist, and whether, if they're religious, whether they are Christian or Jewish or anything else, all seem to get the same impression. I think that's the strongest argument, right? I mean, the argument from scholarly consensus is not something to scoff at, right? It's a shorthand, right? I mean, just saying, well, the consensus doesn't prove anything, right? But because scholars have to innovate, right? If mythicism seemed a viable idea, I would be researching this and trying to publish on this because I would get great book contracts, right? I mean, I would be interviewed all over the place for, being, making this amazing case for this groundbreaking, view, right? And, I like breaking new ground, but in ways that I think are plausible, right? And if mythicism was plausible, I would take the book deal and the six-figure book contract and whatever else might come along with that. And so when scholars do happen to agree, despite this push on us to publish or perish, and so to break new ground and to challenge ideas, when we agree, it's because the evidence points very strongly in that direction, and that seems likely to us. And that brings us back to that book, right? That's why in that A to Z book, it's not about breaking new ground and where might the field be going in the next decades, or what are my quirky ideas, but what's the stuff that we've been over and over and over again, and we think this is what it looks like, or we're still not sure, but here are the two main options. And I think there's a strength to that pointing to the consensus is just a shorthand for look at all this literature, look at how much time has been invested in investigating these things, and notice that despite the fact that in order to keep our jobs we have to publish new stuff and disagree with what's been said before, there's still this stuff that we agree on.
Yeah, very good. So yeah, I mean, that sounds like a good place to leave it, unless you had anything else to mention. Yeah, very good. So
we can see what kind of negative comments you get as a result of this conversation, and then we'll see. We can always follow up some other time. And
yeah, brilliant. Yeah, no, it was fun. I really enjoyed it. I should do it again sometime. So everybody, check out his book coming up in October, being published here on Earth. New Testament A to Z. Yep. All right. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me on here on Earth.
Yep, absolutely. Next time in outer space, right?
If you can manage that, I'll join you.
Yep.